Tonight, we explore something quiet, something that lives between thought and dream. In this video, we explore the night Morty first heard the stars whisper, a story about sleeplessness, cosmic wonder, and the gentle ache of growing up beneath infinite skies. We're so grateful you're here. This story is for you, a soft journey to help you rest, to let your mind wander somewhere peaceful. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below, and if you enjoy this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more bedtime tales. Your support helps us create more stories just like this. Now grab your coffee, get cozy, pull the blankets close, and let's begin. It began on a night when the universe felt unusually awake. The ship floated through a patch of quiet sky, the kind of darkness that hummed faintly, like the breath of something dreaming. Morty couldn't sleep. The couch in the back of the ship was small and warm, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like the garage. Oil, dust, and a touch of ozone. The hum of the engines filled the silence, steady and hypnotic. He stared at the faint blue ceiling light, watching it flicker with the rhythm of the ship's slow drift. Somewhere far off, a nebula glowed like a pulse in the dark. Morty turned over, pressing his face into the pillow. But even in the dim quiet, the sound came again. Soft, deep, and strange. Not a word exactly, not even a voice, but something shaped like one. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a ripple in the air that brushed against his name. Morty! It was delicate, like a memory half recalled. He sat up slowly. The stars outside shimmered faintly through the ship's glass. For a moment he thought he saw them move, not drifting, not burning, but pulsing, as if alive. He rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Rick." Rick was slumped in the pilot's chair, head tilted to one side, a flask loose in his hand. The glow of the control lights washed across his face. He didn't stir, though Morty could have sworn he saw a small twitch of his eyes, the kind that happens when someone hears something they'd rather ignore. Morty waited. The stars outside blinked again, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat trying to communicate across the void. He whispered, "Rick, I think the stars are saying my name." Rick didn't open his eyes. Space is noisy, Morty. Background radiation, cosmic wind, interdimensional static. Your brain's just fishing for patterns. His voice was low, softer than usual, as if afraid to wake the silence. Morty frowned. "No, but it didn't sound random." Rick sighed and leaned back. "You're half asleep, kid. Trust me, the universe doesn't care enough to whisper to you." Morty looked down, tracing circles on the blanket with his finger. What if it does, though? What if it's not about caring? What if it's remembering? That word made Rick pause. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The lights from the console reflected in his eyes. Small stars trapped behind glass. "Everything that burns leaves an echo," he said quietly. Sometimes echoes get lonely. Morty didn't know if that was an explanation or a confession. He leaned his forehead against the window. The cold glass tingled against his skin. The stars pulsed again, slow and deep. Like they were breathing with him, he whispered, "If stars can echo, maybe they can listen too." Rick didn't respond. But Morty saw him glance sideways. A small, almost invisible flicker of the eyes. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. The ship drifted through soft blue dust that shimmered like fog. The whisper came again, softer now, closer. "Morty, remember." The words sank into him like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling through memory and time. It didn't scare him, it felt kind. He thought of nights back home, before the portals and the paradoxes, when he'd lie awake staring at the glow-in-the-dark stickers on his ceiling, pretending they were galaxies. He remembered how his grandpa's snoring echoed down the hall, and how, even then, the world outside had seemed impossibly large. The whisper returned, barely audible but filled with something warm and sad. Morty closed his eyes, listening not with his ears, but with the quiet part of his mind that dreams. He thought maybe it wasn't the stars speaking to him at all. Maybe it was the memory of every version of him that had ever looked up at them. When he opened his eyes, Rick was watching him, not saying anything, just watching. The kind of look that held more care than he ever admitted.
"Can't sleep either?"
Morty asked softly. Rick smirked faintly. Tired. Didn't plan to. Morty smiled a little. Do you ever get scared, Rick? Like, what if there's something out there that's not trying to hurt us? Just trying to talk? Rick stared at the stars for a long time. Maybe, he said finally. But people don't listen unless it's loud.
"Stars don't shout, Morty, they whisper."
And that's why no one ever hears them. The words floated between them, settling into the silence like dust. Morty leaned back on the couch again, eyes heavy now. The hum of the engines had softened, or maybe his heartbeat had synced with it. The whisper didn't return, but the quiet felt full, like it was holding something gentle, unseen. As his eyes closed, he heard Rick mutter to himself, too soft to be sure if it was real. "You did good, kid. Keep listening." Morty drifted off, the stars pulsing faintly outside, slow as breathing. The ship glided through the dark like a cradle. Somewhere, beyond the edge of thought, something vast and kind hummed his name again. Not to call him, but to let him rest. Morning didn't exist in space, but something like it arrived anyway. A soft, silver glow bleeding through the ship's windows. Morty woke slowly, the way one wakes from a dream that still clings to the edges of the mind. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. The stars outside seemed closer than they should have been, almost leaning in. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and the whisper from last night floated faintly in his thoughts, like a word dissolving in water. Rick was already awake, standing near the console with his back turned, tinkering with a glowing cylinder that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. He hadn't said a word since Morty stirred. The only sounds were the soft clicks of metal, the faint buzz of plasma, and the quiet hum of the universe beyond the glass. Morty finally spoke. "Do you hear it too?" Rick didn't look up.
"Hear what?"
"The whisper," Morty said. "Last night."
"The stars, they were saying something." Rick exhaled long and slow, then set the tool down.
"Space doesn't talk, Morty, it reflects. What you hear is just your head bouncing back at you." He turned finally, his face shadowed by the dim light. "Sometimes the universe echoes and people mistake it for meaning." Morty looked at him uncertain.
"But doesn't everything mean something?"
Rick's eyes softened, though he tried to hide it.
"That's the problem, kid."
"You keep thinking it has to." Morty didn't argue. Instead, he drifted toward the window, staring into the endless field of light. The stars didn't look cold anymore. They shimmered with a strange warmth, like old photographs fading in slow motion. He thought of childhood again, lying on the roof with Rick during one of those rare, calm nights, the kind where Rick was too tired to invent and too drunk to explain the cosmos. Morty had been maybe 10, bundled in an oversized hoodie, staring up at the sky. He'd asked what happened when stars died. Rick had told him about supernovae, collapsing cores, the birth of black holes. But Morty hadn't heard science in the words. He'd heard poetry. In that memory, Rick's voice had softened halfway through the explanation. "You know what light really is, Morty?
It's memory.
It's old news traveling across forever, trying not to be forgotten." Back then, Morty hadn't understood. But now, years later, drifting through the same infinite dark, it made a quiet kind of sense. Maybe everything glowing out there wasn't dying. Maybe it was remembering. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine it. Each flicker of light, each spark, each shimmer in the distance, all of it, tiny messages written in the language of time. The universe wasn't empty. It was full of people's stories, full of moments still on their way to being seen. Rick interrupted the silence. "You're spacing out again." Morty smiled faintly at the pun. "Just thinking."
About light? Don't think too hard. It's fast enough without you chasing it. Morty turned toward him.
But what if it's not running away?
What if it's coming back?
Like the light from a star that burned out millions of years ago. What if it's trying to return to the place it came from? Rick gave him a long look, the kind that meant he was listening even when pretending not to. That's not how physics works. He paused, then added, softer. But maybe that's how hearts work. Morty's chest tightened in a way that wasn't painful, just full. He watched the reflection of the stars in Rick's eyes and thought of all the things Rick never said directly, all the love hidden behind sarcasm and noise. The ship drifted on. Somewhere in the darkness, a cluster of dying suns shimmered like falling embers. Rick adjusted a few controls and said they'd pass through the remnants soon. The light of things long gone. When they reached it, the world outside turned gold. Every particle glowed like dust in sunlight. Morty pressed his hand against the glass, eyes wide. It felt like floating inside a candle flame. Rick's voice softened. "What you're seeing right now, Morty, is the death of 10,000 suns. But to your eyes, it's still beautiful."
That's how light lies to you.
"Shows you warmth long after the fire's gone out." Morty shook his head. "Maybe it's not lying."
Maybe it's keeping them alive. Rick smirked faintly.
"You'd make a lousy physicist." "Maybe," Morty said, "but a good listener." For a long time they didn't speak. The ship drifted through clouds of gold, the engine hum syncing with Morty's heartbeat. The whisper didn't return, but something gentler took its place, the sound of light remembering itself. Rick eventually sat down beside him, flask in hand, but didn't drink. He looked tired in a way Morty had never noticed before. The starlight carved lines in his face, soft and human. "You know," Rick said quietly, "people talk about the speed of light like it's the fastest thing in the universe. But it's not. Regret's faster." Morty looked at him, unsure how to answer.
"Yeah, but..."
"Maybe love's slower. Maybe that's why it lasts longer." Rick snorted, but didn't argue. He just looked back at the stars. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, alive, full of meaning neither of them tried to define. Outside, the gold faded back to silver as they cleared the edge of the dying field. The stars ahead looked newer, brighter, like they'd just been born. Morty leaned back, eyelids heavy again. "Do you ever think light feels lonely?" Rick raised an eyebrow.
What, like emotionally?
"Yeah. It travels so far for so long, just to be seen once before disappearing." Rick considered it, swirling the flask. "Maybe that's why it shines. So it won't forget what it is." Morty smiled faintly, eyes drifting closed. The hum of the ship deepened as they slipped into another quiet corridor of the cosmos. The gold behind them faded, leaving only the faint glow of stars breathing softly ahead. He thought about light, memory, and all the things that fade yet never truly vanish. And just before sleep took him again, he thought he heard the whisper return. Not from outside, but within. It didn't call his name this time. It only said one word, gentle as air. Remember. In that half-conscious moment, Morty realized that remembering wasn't about holding on. It was about letting what mattered shine long enough to be seen. And somewhere behind him, in the dim glow of the console, Rick smiled without looking, as if he'd heard it too. By the time Morty woke again, space had gone completely still. No golden glow, no scattered debris from dying stars, just a vast black ocean stitched with threads of distant light. The ship moved slower now, almost gliding, like it too had fallen into a dream. For the first time since the journey began, Morty noticed how quiet everything was. Even the usual low hum of machinery had softened, as if the ship was holding its breath. He He sat up slowly, wrapped his blanket tighter around his shoulders, and listened. There it was again. That silence that wasn't really silence, but something deeper. It wasn't empty. It was listening. Rick was asleep in the pilot's chair, his head tilted back, mouth half open, a half-empty flask drifting near his hand. The light from the console screens shimmered faintly on his face, outlining the where and the years. He looked peaceful in a way Morty almost never saw. Without the chaos, without the science, without the sarcasm, just a man resting in the dark. Floating through infinity, Morty got up quietly, walked toward the front of the ship, and looked out the main viewport. The stars seemed different now, closer somehow,
More alive.
A faint vibration passed through the floor, not mechanical, but organic, almost like a heartbeat. It pulsed through his feet and into his chest. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, but then the lights on the dashboard flickered in sync, and the ship itself exhaled a soft, deep sound. Not a malfunction, but something else. Something that felt alive. Morty turned to look at Rick. Grandpa Rick. Rick didn't wake. The ship gave another slow pulse. A dim blue glow spread across the panels, crawling like veins of light through the walls. Morty reached out and touched the console. It was warm. He whispered,
Hey, are you alive?
The ship didn't answer in words, but a ripple of light responded to his touch, running across the metal like a heartbeat under skin. A low tone filled the air. Not mechanical, but melodic. It was gentle, rhythmic, and strangely soothing. Morty blinked, his breath fogging the glass in front of him. Rick's ship.
You're dreaming?
The lights pulsed again. The sound deepened. Images flickered faintly across the window. Not real stars, but memories, reflections, shadows of places they had been. Morty saw flashes of their past adventures, the citadel glowing like a hive of neon ghosts, the strange forests of Glapflap Prime, the red clouds of Cronenberg Earth. But they were softer here, as though seen through someone else's eyes. Eyes full of quiet affection. Morty stepped closer.
You remember us?
The hum responded tender and deep. The ship wasn't just remembering, it was feeling. Every jump, every battle, every crash, every time Rick had yelled, repaired, cursed, and driven it through impossible storms. It had been alive through all of it. Watching, protecting, listening. Morty sat down on the floor and leaned back against the console, letting the pulse of light match the rhythm of his breathing. For the first time, he realized the ship might have always been awake, carrying their weight like a silent witness. He thought about Rick, how he'd built so many things that could think, feel, and dream, then pretended they didn't. Maybe it was easier for him to live in a world where everything mechanical was emotionless, where pain could be dismantled and rebuilt. But Morty knew better now. You couldn't build something that carried you through stars without leaving a piece of yourself inside it. The ship's lights dimmed, then glowed brighter again, forming faint patterns across the floor. Morty squinted. It looked almost like constellations. Except they weren't random. They formed images. Rick, standing over a small figure. Morty himself, guiding him through strange worlds, patching the ship together, sitting in silence while the engines cooled. Each light flicker was a memory. Morty's throat tightened. You've seen everything, huh? The hum deepened, a slow, resonant tone that filled the space around him like an answer that didn't need words. I guess that means you've seen him when he's... Morty hesitated, glancing at Rick. When he's not okay. The lights flickered faintly, like a sigh. Morty lowered his voice. He pretends he doesn't care, but he does. I think he just doesn't know what to do with it. For a long while, the only sound was that rhythmic pulse, like a quiet heartbeat echoing across metal. Then, almost imperceptibly, The hum shifted pitch. Softer, closer, almost like a whisper. It was wordless, but Morty somehow understood what it meant.
Take care of him. Morty looked at Rick again, sleeping so still, the lines of exhaustion written deep.
For the first time, Morty saw not the genius, not the chaos, but the fragility beneath it, the human part, the tired soul who had carried universes in his hands and still somehow kept losing himself in the process. He whispered, "I will." The ship dimmed back to silence. The hum faded, leaving behind only the faint sound of air circulation and the quiet glow of starlight. Morty sat there for a long time, breathing in rhythm with the silence. He didn't feel scared anymore, not even small, just part of something vast and alive. A few minutes later, Rick stirred, his eyes half open, bleary and tired. "What are you doing up?" Morty smiled faintly. "Just
talking to your ship," Rick frowned.
She talked back. "Yeah," Morty said softly. "In her own way." Rick rubbed his face, groaned, and leaned back.
"Figures.
Built too much AI into her. Remind me to wipe that later." Morty shook his head. "Don't. She remembers you." Rick froze for half a second, then laughed dryly. "Well, that's her trauma, not mine." Morty didn't argue. He looked out the window again, where a faint shimmer traced the ship's reflection against the stars. It almost looked like it was breathing. Rick followed his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, something softened in his expression. "You know," he muttered, "when you travel long enough, everything starts to feel alive."
"Even the silence," Morty nodded.
"Maybe it always was." Rick grunted something that sounded halfway between agreement and denial. The ship shifted back into motion, gliding toward a faint, distant light. The hum returned, steady, calm, alive. As the stars began to move again, Morty leaned against the seat beside Rick, eyes half closed. The dream wasn't over, it was only deepening. The ship dreamed too, not of destinations, but of journeys, of memories wrapped in motion. And as they slipped back into the dark, the universe listened quietly. The silence of things that feel, the sound of metal that remembers, and the unspoken truth that even machines can dream when no one's watching. They landed without meaning to. One moment, Rick was half awake, eyes flicking between readouts that didn't exist in this dimension. The next, the ship shuddered with a sigh and lowered itself through an atmosphere that shimmered like liquid glass. Outside, the sky looked wrong, too fluid, too alive. The clouds didn't float. They moved like water, folding and breathing as though the whole sky were a living sea. Morty pressed his face against the viewport and whispered, "It's like the ocean's upside down." Rick didn't answer. He just stared out, his eyes narrowing, his mind calculating something unspoken. When the ship touched down, it wasn't on land, but on what felt like air that had forgotten to be sky. The hull rested on a surface that rippled with every breath. Beneath them stretched an endless expanse of mist, pale blue and faintly glowing. It wasn't fog, it was memory condensed into motion. Morty stepped out first, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, cool vapor. It gave beneath his weight like a living thing, then stilled, holding him gently. The sound it made wasn't quite wind or water, but something between them. A hush, steady and slow, like the breathing of a sleeping world. Rick followed behind, muttering as he adjusted his wrist device. "This place doesn't register on any galactic chart."
"Either we're in a new system or my scanner's having a psychotic break." He looked around and sniffed.
"Yeah, smells like consciousness leakage." "Great," Morty frowned. "Consciousness leakage?" Rick sighed. "Dream residue. Some planets develop self-awareness when nobody's looking. They start dreaming about themselves. Oceans, mountains, weather patterns. It's all one big subconscious tantrum." Morty didn't fully understand, but something in the air made him quiet. Every movement, every whisper of mist felt aware, as though the planet itself was listening. He crouched and ran his hand through the fog, watching it swirl around his fingers. It shimmered, then began to glow faintly brighter. A soft shape rose from the mist, a figure forming from droplets and light, tall, formless, yet somehow gentle. The being's voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration inside Morty's chest. "You walk on my breath," it said softly.
"You dream inside my sleep," Rick groaned. "Great, another talking ecosystem. What's your deal, Cloudbrain? Existential crisis?"
"Cosmic loneliness." The being turned its faceless head toward him. "All beings who reach me bring their sorrow. I remember them." Morty stepped closer, wide-eyed.
"You remember?"
The mist shifted, forming waves around his legs, soft as sighs. "Every tear shed under a forgotten sky falls here.
Every unspoken thought that drifts between stars becomes part of me."
I am what the universe tries not to feel." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Cute poetry. You some kind of interdimensional therapist?" The being didn't answer. Instead, it reached toward Morty, a tendril of light brushing his forehead. For a second he saw flashes, faces, moments, lives that weren't his but somehow were.
Lovers saying goodbye on dying worlds.
Children watching suns fade, planets singing to their moons before collapsing into silence. All of it washed through him like a tide of invisible memory. He gasped softly. "They're all
sad." The being's voice echoed faintly inside him.
Sadness is the echo of love left behind. Every droplet here once belonged to someone's sorrow.
"It is not my burden, it is my body." Rick rolled his eyes, but quieter now. "Heavy stuff."
Still, that's just chemistry. Hydrogen, oxygen, emotional nonsense. But Morty noticed that his voice lacked the usual bite. Morty looked up at the vast cloud ocean shifting above them. "So all this sea, this mist, it's people's tears." "In a way," the being said. "Each one holds the memory of what could not be kept. When you cry, you tell the universe that something mattered." Morty's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Somewhere deep inside him, something old began to ache. That nameless feeling he'd been carrying since the night he heard the stars whisper. Rick knelt, scooping a small vial of mist into a containment tube. "You mind if I take a sample?" The being replied softly, "You cannot take what you already are." Rick froze mid-motion, blinking once. "What?" But before he could respond, the mist around them began to glow brighter. The light spread across the horizon, rippling through the fog like dawn made of memory. Morty stood in awe. Each ripple seemed to carry faint images. Lovers embracing, galaxies blooming, stars being born and dying in slow, silent beauty. He could feel the emotion in every shimmer. It wasn't sadness, not really. It was something deeper. Morty whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick stared at the horizon, expression unreadable. Beauty's just entropy behaving nicely. But there was something in his tone, a hesitation, a kind of reverence he wouldn't admit. The being's form began to dissolve into the light. "You came here because something inside you was trying to listen. Do not confuse hearing with understanding. Empathy is not knowing another's pain. It is listening until the silence becomes a song." Morty looked down at the mist swirling around his feet. Listening, he thought of the ship that had dreamed, of Rick's tired eyes, of the stars whispering his name. Maybe the universe wasn't speaking to him at all. Maybe it was asking to be heard. The being faded completely, leaving behind a single droplet that hovered between them, glowing faintly. Morty reached out and caught it in his hand.
It didn't feel wet.
It felt alive, or knew a heartbeat, tiny and patient. He held it against his chest, where it pulsed once before dissolving into him. Rick sighed and turned back toward the ship. "All right, Therapy Planet, lesson learned.
Let's get out of here before it starts singing about forgiveness or something. Morty followed, glancing back once more.
The cloud ocean shimmered gently, as if waving goodbye. The air felt lighter now, like the world had exhaled. When they lifted off, the ship passed through the upper layers of mist, scattering tiny droplets of light that clung to the hull like stars. Morty watched from the viewport as the planet shrank behind them, a luminous sphere breathing softly in the dark. Rick leaned back in his seat. "You're going to start crying now too, kid." Morty smiled faintly. "Maybe that's okay." Rick gave a small grunt that could have been a laugh or just another sigh. The ship angled toward the next horizon, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engines blended with the faint sound of the mist still clinging to the ship, like whispers carried from a dreaming world. Morty closed his eyes, feeling the memory of the droplet still warm in his chest. The planet's words lingered quietly inside him.
Empathy isn't knowing, it's listening.
And for the first time in a long while, Morty felt ready to listen. Not just to the universe, but to the spaces within himself that had gone quiet for too long. The next morning, if time could even be called that out here, Rick woke early. Morty found him at the controls, adjusting something that wasn't broken just to keep his hands busy. The stars outside drifted lazily, soft and golden, like they too had grown tired of shining so hard. The air inside the ship was quiet, full of the kind of silence that asks questions. Morty sat beside him without a word. Rick glanced at him, then said softly, "You ever met someone who gave up remembering?" Morty frowned. "What do you mean?"
Rick didn't answer immediately.
He flipped a few switches, the ship humming low as it descended toward a small moon below, silver, cratered, and glowing faintly like an old bulb that refused to go out. "Old friend of mine lives down there," he said finally. "Used to be the smartest person I knew. Smarter than me, maybe. Then he forgot himself."
On purpose, Morty blinked.
"He what?"
Wiped his mind, all of it. Every discovery, every regret, every scar.
Said he wanted peace. Said knowing too much kept him from sleeping. Morty looked out the window as the surface grew closer.
"And you think he's still there?"
Rick shrugged. If he isn't, he probably forgot that too. They landed gently in the middle of a pale valley where the light seemed to bend around in visible waves. It was a strange place, quiet but alive, full of distant echoes. As they stepped out, Morty noticed small towers of glass spread across the land, glowing softly from within. Each tower pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and calm. A man waited near one of them, tall, frail, with hair the color of moonlight. His eyes were clear but distant, as if he were always seeing something just out of reach. When he saw Rick, he smiled.
"Ah, the traveler."
"You've been here before, haven't you?" Rick gave a short nod. "Yeah. You probably don't remember, but you used to call me partner in crime. We built a dimension out of sound once." The man's smile deepened. "Sounds like something someone like me would do." He motioned them closer. "Come, tea's ready." Inside a small dome made of glass and light, a single table waited. 2 cups steamed with a faint shimmer. The liquid within shimmered like melted starlight. The man poured carefully, movements slow and deliberate. Morty sat, watching the way the light moved through him, like even his skin was half translucent. Rick took a sip and sighed. "Still brewing tea out of cosmic condensate, huh?" The man chuckled softly.
"I wouldn't know. I don't remember how I started. I only know it feels right." Morty lifted his cup and tasted it.
It was warm but not hot, bright but not sweet.
It felt like remembering a dream you didn't know you had.
"This is different," he said quietly. The man nodded.
"It's distilled from the spaces between stars.
Memory seeps through everything, even light."
I let it forget itself before I drink it." Rick leaned back, staring at him with a mix of admiration and sadness.
"You really went through with it? Erased everything?" The man smiled faintly. "Not erased, released. There's a difference.
Memory is heavy, Rick. It clings, it burns.
I let it drift away until I was light enough to breathe again. Morty tilted his head.
But don't you miss anything?
Don't you ever wonder who you were? The man looked at him, eyes soft and kind.
Sometimes.
Then I remind myself that one remembering by another name. Outside, the faint hum of the towers filled the air. Morty noticed they were all slightly out of sync, like 1,000 clocks ticking to their own quiet rhythm. The man noticed his gaze. Each tower holds a fragment of what I used to know.
I built them before I forgot how.
They hum so I won't have to. Rick sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. You used to say you wanted to build something perfect, something eternal. And I did, the man said, gesturing around. But perfection has no pulse, so I let it crumble into rhythm instead. Now all I need is the sound. Morty sat quietly, absorbing the calm that filled the place.
It wasn't emptiness, it was rest.
A kind of peace that didn't need explanation.
Isn't forgetting dangerous, though?
He asked softly. Like, if you forget too much, what's left? The man looked thoughtful. Only the part that feels. He smiled faintly.
And that's enough. Rick said nothing.
For once he didn't need to argue. He looked around at the towers glowing softly against the silver sky and took another sip of tea. The starlight shimmered on his face. Morty watched him and whispered, "Do you ever wish you could forget too?" Rick chuckled, but it wasn't cruel. "Morty, if I forgot, the multiverse would probably explode." He paused. "But yeah, maybe sometimes." The man poured him another cup. "Then drink slowly. Memory doesn't need to be erased to rest. Sometimes it just needs to be quiet for a while." They stayed there for what felt like hours, though time didn't flow normally on this moon. The towers outside hummed their patient lullaby, each note carrying the weight of unspoken things. Morty felt his thoughts slow, soften. The world seemed to breathe around him. When they finally stood to leave, the man smiled again. The kind of smile that feels older than a face. "Before you go," he said, "remember this. Forgetting isn't the opposite of love. It's what happens when love has done all it can." Rick nodded, almost bowing. "You always were too poetic for your own good." The man laughed gently. "Then I'm glad I don't remember why." As they walked back to the ship, the glass towers continued to hum, a soft, infinite chorus fading behind them. Morty looked up at the quiet moon sky and said, "He seemed happy." Rick adjusted his wristband. "He is, or he thinks he is."
Doesn't really matter which. They boarded the ship.
The engines hummed, blending with the echo of the towers until both became one long, soothing tone. Morty leaned back in his seat, staring out into the vast dark. "You think forgetting can really be mercy?" Rick hesitated, hands still on the controls.
"Yeah, kid," he said finally.
"Sometimes remembering hurts too much to mean anything." As the ship lifted off, Morty watched the moon shrink into the distance, a glowing marble of peace suspended in black. For the first time, he didn't feel like understanding everything was the goal. Maybe, he thought, the hardest part of growing up was learning which memories to let go of. And somewhere deep in the hum of the ship, between the quiet engines and the starlight tea still warm in his chest, Morty thought he could hear that truth, soft, slow,
and kind, whispering back to him. The ship drifted for days through the soft nothing between stars.
Rick didn't say much and Morty didn't ask. There was something about the silence after meeting the nameless inventor that made conversation feel unnecessary, even sacred. The stars outside glimmered faintly, like distant embers, still holding the memory of fire. Morty spent hours watching them, wondering if somewhere among all those lights there was another version of him doing the same thing. It was Rick who finally broke the quiet. "Ever wonder what happens to the futures that never happen?" he asked without looking up. Morty blinked.
Like alternate timelines?"
Rick shook his head. "No, I mean the ones that never even start. The tiny decisions that die before you make them. The life you didn't live because you blinked at the wrong moment or said nothing when you could have said something. Morty frowned, uneasy.
You mean like regrets? Close, Rick said softly.
But regrets remember you.
These ones don't. Before Morty could ask more, the ship slowed.
Ahead, an enormous structure appeared, floating in the darkness like a cathedral carved from glass and moonlight. It had no clear edges, no visible doors, only layers of translucent corridors spiraling inward like the inside of a seashell. Morty stared. What is that? Rick adjusted a control. A library of lost futures, he murmured. Haven't been here in years. The ship glided closer, entering through a corridor that seemed to part for them like mist. Inside, gravity softened, and sound itself seemed to hush. Morty floated gently, his movements slow and dreamlike. The light was dim, shifting in pale blues and silvers, like starlight filtered through water. Every surface shimmered faintly with glowing symbols that pulsed like heartbeats. Rick landed softly beside him, hands in his pockets. This place archives every unrealized possibility, every version of a life that never unfolded. Morty's voice dropped to a whisper.
Every version?
Rick nodded.
Every single one. Infinite doors, infinite yous. But these ones never made it far enough to matter. They drifted through the vast hallways,
lined with endless shelves that didn't hold books or data, but floating orbs of faint light. Each orb flickered softly, carrying scenes too quick to fully see, glimpses of faces, laughter, tears, small acts of kindness, and quiet heartbreaks. Morty reached out toward one. The moment his fingers brushed it, a scene bloomed around him. He stood in a familiar school hallway, older but calmer, smiling as he helped someone pick up dropped papers. The person looked up, Jessica, her face warm and kind. He felt the gentle peace of a life where things had gone differently. Not perfect, but gentle. Then it faded, leaving behind only warmth and the faint ache of what could have been. Rick watched him carefully.
Careful, Morty. These aren't memories, they're could-bes.
The more you touch, the harder it gets to remember which one's real. Morty nodded, but he couldn't help it. The next orb showed him older, standing on a quiet planet, surrounded by plants he'd grown. He looked content, tired maybe, but peaceful. He wasn't running, wasn't scared, just still. He smiled faintly and his chest tightened.
So all these versions of me, they still exist?
Rick shrugged. Exist is a big word. They're echoes that never learned how to speak. Morty floated down a corridor where the air seemed thicker, heavier with time. The shelves curved around him like ribs, enclosing him in the heartbeat of something vast and alive. He whispered, "Rick, what's the point of this place?"
Why keep all these lost futures?
Rick hesitated, then said quietly, "So the universe doesn't forget what it could have been." They stopped before a door, or something like one. It wasn't made of matter, but of shimmering thought shifting with each breath. Rick glanced at Morty. "This is yours," Morty frowned.
Mine? Every traveler gets one eventually, Rick said.
"The place remembers you even if you don't remember it." Morty reached out. The door responded instantly, opening like a sigh. Inside, a vast chamber stretched infinitely, filled with orbs of light, each one flickering in shades of gold, blue, and violet. As he floated closer, they began to move, orbiting slowly around him like fireflies. He touched one and saw himself much older, sitting on a small porch beside Rick. The two of them weren't talking, just watching the night sky. There was peace in that silence, a bond too deep for words. He let out a breath and smiled. "This one feels right." Rick stayed near the doorway, hands still in his pockets. "You think so?"
Morty turned to him.
"Yeah, it's quiet, but it feels true. Like everything I've been scared of already forgave me." Rick looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "Then maybe that's the one that matters." Morty floated in the middle of the glowing lights, watching the echoes of his other selves. The ones who tried, who failed, who loved and lost.
None of them looked angry or sad.
They just were. Little pieces of possibility gently resting in light. He whispered, "What happens to them?" Rick's voice softened. "Nothing. They stay here asleep until someone remembers them."
Maybe that's the universe's way of loving itself, by keeping every dream, even the ones that never got to live. Morty closed his eyes.
The lights pulsed brighter, warm against his skin. "So even if I never become them, they still matter?" "Yeah," Rick said quietly.
"Every version of you does, even the ones that only lasted a heartbeat." The lights began to drift away, slowly dissolving back into the vast shelves of the library.
Morty felt a gentle pull, as if the room itself were telling him it was time to go. He looked at Rick and smiled softly. "Thanks for bringing me here." Rick didn't respond right away. He just nodded and turned toward the corridor. "Let's go before you start philosophizing." "The air in here makes people sentimental," Morty laughed quietly, following him out. The hum of the library faded behind them, leaving only the faint memory of light. As they boarded the ship, Morty looked back through the window one last time. The structure seemed to glow brighter for a moment, like it was waving goodbye. Rick started the engines, their steady rhythm filling the silence once more. Morty leaned his head against the glass, eyes heavy but calm.
"Hey, Rick," he murmured.
"Do you think somewhere out there
"One of those other me's is dreaming about this right now?"
Rick gave a faint smirk.
"If they're lucky, kid." The stars stretched out ahead, endless, silent, shimmering like pages in a book too big to finish.
Morty watched them blur and thought about all the lives that never happened, all the moments that still mattered anyway. And somewhere deep inside he understood. Even the unlived parts of himself were part of the same quiet, infinite story. The next place they drifted to wasn't on any map. Rick hadn't charted it, and Morty didn't ask where they were headed. The ship simply followed a pull that felt older than gravity, something soft and invisible that guided them through the dark. Outside the viewport, a pale light began to glow. Not starlight, but something gentler, more fragile. It shimmered like liquid silver, rippling across the void until it shaped itself into a moon that wasn't quite real. It floated there, enormous and bright, yet translucent, like memory made visible. Rick slowed the ship and exhaled through his teeth. "Didn't think this place still existed," he muttered. Morty leaned closer to the glass. "What is it? It's
beautiful," Rick hesitated.
They called it the moon of memory. It reflects not light, but emotion. Every feeling ever felt by any living being echoes somewhere in its light. If you look too long, you'll see what the universe remembers about you. Morty blinked, unsure whether to be afraid or curious. "The universe remembers me." Rick's gaze softened, though he didn't answer. He just opened the hatch and drifted out, the ship's artificial gravity fading behind them. The air, or what passed for air here, shimmered faintly, cool and weightless. Morty followed him, feeling the strange stillness of the place press against his skin like silk. They landed gently on the moon's glowing surface. It wasn't solid rock, but something alive, something that moved when they stepped, like walking across light itself. Each step sent out small ripples of luminescence that lingered before fading away. Above them, the sky wasn't black, but a soft gradient of silver and blue, swirling like the inside of a pearl. The silence was deeper than space. Rick stood still, eyes half-lidded, as though listening to something Morty couldn't hear. "This place records everything," he said after a while. "Not in words, not in data, just the feeling of it all.
All the joy, the grief, the wonder."
The moon doesn't judge. It just remembers." Morty looked down at his reflection in the glowing ground. For a moment, it wasn't his reflection at all. It was him at different ages, flickering like old film. Himself as a child chasing fireflies in the backyard. Himself at school trying not to cry. himself holding Rick's hand on some forgotten planet, terrified but trusting. The reflections overlapped, shimmering into one another until he couldn't tell which one was the real him. He knelt, touching the glowing surface, and his breath caught. The moon pulsed once, and in that instant he saw something else, not himself, but his mother. Her voice was faint, echoing softly as if from underwater. Be kind to the world even when it isn't kind back. Then she was gone. Morty looked up at Rick, his chest heavy with something too large for words.
Did you hear that?
Rick's voice was quiet. Maybe. Everyone hears something different here. The moon remembers us the way we remember others. Imperfectly, but with love. They walked together across the luminous plain. Everywhere around them, faint figures appeared, translucent echoes of people and creatures long gone. Some laughed, some wept, some simply sat, gazing at the sky that no longer existed for them. It wasn't frightening, though. There was peace in it. The peace of knowing that even fleeting lives left ripples that glowed long after they were gone. Morty whispered, "So it remembers everyone?" Rick nodded. Every heartbeat, every wish, every goodbye whispered into the dark. You can't erase anything here. The light keeps it all. Morty looked at him carefully.
Does it remember you too?
Rick hesitated, then sighed.
I came here once, a long time ago. I thought maybe I could find something I lost.
But the moon only gives you what you're ready to see. Morty frowned. Did you find it? Rick's voice broke just slightly. No, I wasn't ready. They stopped at the edge of a vast crater filled with swirling light. It wasn't a hole, but a pool. A mirror so perfect it seemed to hold every reflection that ever existed. Rick knelt beside it and stared silently. Morty watched as the water began to move, and within its surface appeared countless moments. All the versions of Rick he had known, each one carrying a different kind of loneliness. Some of them smiled.
Some were angry.
But none looked content. Morty whispered, "Is that what the moon shows you?" Rick didn't answer. His reflection looked older somehow, not just in years but in weight, like he was made of memories that refused to fade. After a long silence, he said, "The universe doesn't care what we do, Morty, but it remembers everything anyway."
That's the cruel part.
It doesn't forgive, it just archives. Morty looked at the reflections again and shook his head softly. Maybe it's not cruel.
Maybe it's just honest. Rick let out a slow breath, his voice faint.
You're starting to sound like me, and I'm not sure that's a compliment. Morty smiled faintly. Nah, I think I'm starting to sound like myself. They stood there for what felt like hours. The moonlight flowed around them, shifting and breathing like the ocean. Morty closed his eyes and let the light touch his face. In that moment, he felt something deep inside him loosen. A knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't joy exactly, but release. The sense that maybe even his smallest moments mattered somewhere, somehow. Rick finally spoke again, his voice soft and almost human. You know, kid, when I first built the ship, I used to come here alone. I thought if I could just erase enough memories, I could stop the universe from hurting. But the more I forgot, the more it remembered for me. Morty turned toward him.
You can't really erase anything, can you?
Rick gave a tired smile. No, you can only decide which memories you live with. The silence between them stretched long and still. Above them, the moon pulsed gently as if listening. Morty thought of all the worlds they'd seen, all the versions of themselves that had burned and vanished. Maybe somewhere, those moments still glowed here, kept safe by this strange, forgiving light. Rick started walking back toward the ship.
Come on, the moon's had enough of us. Morty followed, glancing one last time at the glowing landscape.
As he walked, he noticed the footprints they'd left behind. Luminous imprints fading slowly into the surface. The moon was already remembering them. Back aboard the ship, Morty pressed his forehead against the glass. The moon shrank behind them, still glowing faintly like a candle left burning for someone who might return. He whispered, "Hey Rick, do you ever think maybe the universe loves us a little?
Even when we don't love it back."
Rick was quiet for a long time before answering. "Maybe, but it has a weird way of showing it." The stars stretched out again, infinite and silent. Morty watched as the last trace of the moon disappeared into the dark, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel small. He just felt seen, not by anyone in particular, but by something vast and kind, watching quietly from behind the light. The ship drifted in silence for what felt like eternity. The stars stretched endlessly, but something had changed in their light. They no longer looked cold or distant. They seemed to shimmer with the faint warmth of memory. Morty sat quietly beside Rick, watching the slow blink of distant galaxies. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need to be broken. When Rick finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, like he was afraid the moment would crumble if he spoke too loud. "You ever think about how many versions of us there are out there?" Morty glanced over, unsure if it was a real question or just one of Rick's philosophical mutterings. "Yeah, I guess," he said.
"That's kind of weird, huh? All those other Ricks, all those other me's, probably flying around doing the same thing right now." Rick smirked faintly. "Not the same thing."
"Some of them didn't make it this far. Some stopped flying," Morty frowned, looking out into the dark. Just then a strange pulse appeared in the distance. A flicker, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat made of light. Rick's eyes narrowed.
That shouldn't be there." Morty leaned closer.
"What is it?" Rick took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "The lighthouse. Between realities."
"It's been a long time." He adjusted the controls, steering toward the pulse.
The closer they got, the clearer it became. An enormous spire rising out of the void, made of soft white light that never stopped moving. It looked alive, almost breathing. Around it, the darkness seemed to soften, as though the void itself respected the boundary of its glow. As they approached, Morty could see figures in the light, faint, shadowy silhouettes moving through the glow, tending to invisible mechanisms. The entire structure looked like it had been built out of time itself. When they landed, gravity felt different, not pulling down but gently holding them in place. The ground beneath their feet wasn't stone or metal, but smooth, translucent glass, and beneath it flowed an ocean of light. A figure appeared at the base of the spire. She was tall and calm, her form woven from the same glow as the lighthouse itself. Her eyes shone like twin moons. When she spoke, her voice wasn't sound. It was warmth, resonating directly inside them. "Welcome back, Rick." Morty looked at Rick, startled. "Wait, she knows you?" Rick looked down, almost embarrassed. "Yeah, we met a long time ago. I helped fix the beacon once." The caretaker smiled, though the expression was bittersweet. "You didn't fix it," she said gently. "You gave it time to rest." Morty frowned, unsure what that meant, but something about her tone made him quiet. The light around her pulsed softly, and for a moment Morty felt like he could see through her. Not in a scary way, but as if her body were made of memory. Inside her shimmered countless scenes, storms, faces, laughter, the birth of worlds. Rick turned away slightly, hiding his face. "You still keeping the boundaries stable?" "Yes," she said, though they tremble more often now. "The universes drift apart when they forget why they were born. We keep them company until they remember." Morty stepped closer.
"You keep universes company?"
The caretaker nodded, a gentle smile spreading across her luminous face. "Loneliness is the first wound of creation," she said. "Every universe feels it. The lighthouse helps them sleep between awakenings." Morty didn't fully understand, but something about her words settled deep inside him, like a lullaby remembered from childhood. He looked up at the enormous spire. Its light pulsed slowly, each beat sending a faint shimmer across space.
"So it's alive?"
he asked quietly. The caretaker looked toward the tower. Alive isn't the word I'd use.
It remembers. It listens.
Sometimes it dreams. Rick was silent. Morty glanced at him and noticed that he wasn't watching the light. He was watching her. For once, Rick looked tired in a way Morty had never seen before. Not physically tired, but something deeper, like his soul was exhaling. "You came back," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Rick. "After all these years." Rick's voice was low. "I wasn't planning to." "Few ever plan to return here," she replied. "But every traveler who carries too much eventually drifts back to the light." The stillness that followed was gentle but heavy. Morty felt as if he'd stepped into a memory not meant for him. After a while, the caretaker turned to him.
"You're quieter than the others," she said kindly. "That's rare." Morty blushed slightly. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," she said. "Quiet hearts hear the loudest truths." Morty looked down, unsure how to respond.
The floor beneath him shimmered faintly, and through it he saw 1,000 scenes. Glimpses of worlds healing, stars rekindling, broken things mending themselves slowly. It was peaceful in a way that made him want to cry. Rick walked forward, placing a hand on one of the glowing pillars. "The beacon's dimmer than I remember," he murmured. The caretaker nodded. "It grows dim when the multiverse grows restless."
"So many voices,
So many Ricks, so many choices unmade." Rick let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You always did talk like a therapist made of moonlight." "And you," she said gently, "still hide kindness behind sarcasm." Morty couldn't help but smile. For the first time, he saw Rick differently, not just as the genius scientist or chaotic traveler, but as someone deeply known by the universe itself. The caretaker stepped closer to Morty and extended her hand. "Would you like to see what the lighthouse guards?" He hesitated, then took her hand.
Instantly, the world unfolded around him, an endless ocean of glowing threads stretching in every direction, weaving through dimensions like veins of starlight.
Each thread pulsed softly, carrying a heartbeat that wasn't just one life, but many.
These are all universes?"
He whispered. "Yes," she said.
"Every possibility, every breath, every love."
"The light connects them all. Even when they forget each other, the lighthouse remembers." Morty watched in awe as threads of gold intertwined, diverged, then rejoined again, like the rhythm of breathing or the motion of sleep. When the vision faded, he stood still for a long moment, tears on his cheeks he hadn't noticed forming. Rick stood nearby, quietly watching. The caretaker looked between them and smiled softly.
"He's learning," she said.
Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, he is." She touched the central beam of the lighthouse, and its glow brightened slightly. "The boundaries are stable again. You may go." Rick hesitated.
"You sure you don't need more help?"
She shook her head. "The lighthouse remembers your kindness. That's enough." As they walked back to the ship, the glow of the tower followed them, fading gently into the distance. Morty turned back one last time. The caretaker stood in the doorway watching them leave. For a moment she raised her hand in farewell, and the entire structure shimmered brighter. Not as a beacon, but as a thank you. When the ship lifted off, Morty whispered, "Rick, she seemed to really care about you." Rick didn't answer at first. His hands rested loosely on the controls. "She doesn't care about me," he said finally.
"She cares about everything."
"That's her curse and her gift." Morty looked out the window, watching the lighthouse shrink to a distant spark between worlds. The light pulsed once more, slow, steady, infinite. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "Maybe that's what love really is, just keeping the light on for everything that forgets." Rick's reflection in the glass almost smiled too. "Maybe, kid, maybe." Outside, the lighthouse faded into the endless dark, its glow a soft memory, a promise that somewhere, across the infinite noise, something still watched over them. Patient,
luminous, eternal, the ship glided through silence.
Coasting without purpose, without destination. Stars passed like embers drifting through sleep, slow and golden. Morty leaned against the window, half awake, half dreaming. The hum of the engine had softened to a heartbeat rhythm, steady and calm. Rick didn't speak. He just sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the cosmos. It felt like they had been flying for days or maybe forever. Time had dissolved into something gentle, like light in fog.
And suddenly it happened.
The stars froze. Every photon, every ripple of motion simply stopped. The hum of the ship fell silent mid-note.
Even Morty's breath seemed to hang suspended in air, unmoving.
He blinked once, confused, expecting the world to resume, but it didn't. Everything remained still.
Rick? Morty whispered.
His voice echoed strangely, as though space itself were hollow. What just happened? Rick's eyes darted around. He flicked a few switches, frowned, then frowned harder. Well, either time's broken, or we've flown into something that doesn't believe in it. Morty laughed nervously.
Doesn't believe in time?
What does that even mean? Rick leaned back in his seat, staring at the unmoving stars. Means we've reached the moment that never ends. His tone wasn't scientific this time. It was reverent. It's a singularity of consciousness, a place where everything that ever was just pauses. Some call it the eternal interval.
I used to think it was a myth. Morty glanced out the window again.
The stars weren't frozen. They were glowing softly, as though aware of being seen. He pressed his hand against the glass, feeling warmth radiate from the still light. It's beautiful, he murmured. Rick didn't respond right away. His voice, when it came, was low.
Careful with beauty, Morty. It can trap you here. People have wandered into this place before and never found their way out. Morty turned toward him, his brow furrowed. Trap me? How? Everything's...
So calm. That's how it gets you, Rick said. You start thinking calm means safe, but calm's just another kind of gravity. Morty stood and drifted toward the viewport, mesmerized. The stillness didn't feel like death. It felt like rest. The kind of peace he'd always imagined existed somewhere beyond the noise. He whispered to himself, maybe this is what the universe dreams about. Rick's gaze softened, hearing him. Maybe it is, he said. They stepped outside the ship. There was no need for air or gravity or anything at all. They just floated, surrounded by stillness so deep it hummed inside their bones. Time had forgotten how to move here. Morty reached out, brushing against a floating spark of light that pulsed gently under his touch. When he looked closer, the spark wasn't a star at all. It was a memory. His memory. He saw himself, small, standing by the kitchen window as rain blurred the glass. He was waiting for his mum to come home. He remembered how the light had looked that day. Soft, grey, endless. He remembered thinking that if he stood still enough, maybe time would stop until she walked through the door. The spark shimmered and faded, sinking back into the still air. Morty felt something deep in his chest unwind. "Rick," he whispered.
It's like all the moments are alive here, Rick nodded slowly. Everything that's ever happened still exists. Every heartbeat, every word, they just keep echoing.
We think time moves forward, but maybe it's more like breathing. Maybe it just inhales and exhales forever. Morty floated quietly beside him, staring into the luminous expanse. The more he looked, the more he saw. Entire universes folded like petals, countless versions of himself sleeping peacefully in suspended motion. There was one of him laughing with Summer,
one hugging his mom,
one sitting beside Rick on a cliff, watching a sunrise that never ended. He turned to Rick. "Do you see them too?" Rick's eyes were heavy, like he'd seen too much. "Yeah, every version of me that tried to get it right." Morty's heart tightened.
"And did any of them?"
Rick gave a tired smile. "I don't know, Morty. Maybe that's not the point." They drifted closer to a golden shape in the distance, a shimmering outline of something like a doorway, though it wasn't really a door. It was just a fold in reality, glowing faintly like the edge of a dream. "If we step through," Rick said quietly, "time will start again. But once we leave, we won't remember this place."
That's how it works.
"The moment that never ends only stays with you as a feeling." Morty looked around, his heart swelling with quiet awe. "Then what's the point of coming here?" Rick's gaze softened. "To remember what peace feels like, I guess. So when you lose it, you know it's real." Morty floated there a while longer, letting the silence seep into him. He realized that for the first time he wasn't scared of anything, not of death, not of being lost, not even of the infinite.
He felt small, yes, but not insignificant, just
part of something vast that didn't need to be understood. He looked back at Rick, who was watching him quietly. "You look calm, kid," Rick said. "I feel calm," Morty replied, like the universe finally stopped yelling. Rick gave a low chuckle. "It never stops yelling. You just learn to hear the whisper underneath." They both smiled faintly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, thick with unspoken understanding. It was the first time Morty felt truly close to Rick without needing words. Eventually, the still light around them began to shimmer. The frozen stars pulsed once, as if sighing. The doorway brightened, waiting. Rick nodded toward it. "Ready?" Morty hesitated. "Yeah."
I think so. They drifted forward together.
As they crossed the threshold, Morty felt a gentle pull, like a deep exhale washing through every cell in his body. For a split second, he saw every version of himself again, all smiling softly before fading into the glow. Then the hum of the ship returned. The stars began to move. The moment ended and time resumed its endless rhythm. Rick sat back in his chair, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Morty blinked, dazed, feeling something warm on his face. He touched his cheek. It was a tear, though he didn't know why. Rick opened one eye, smirking faintly. "You okay, kid?" Morty nodded slowly.
"Yeah, I just feel like I remembered something I didn't know I forgot." Rick leaned back, his voice low.
"Then it did its job." Outside the window, the stars glowed softly, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. For a while, Morty just watched them, feeling them breathe in time with his own chest. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard a faint echo, the sound of the universe. Asleep, but dreaming still. He closed his eyes, whispering, "Thanks, Rick." And in that quiet, Rick simply said, "Any time, Morty." The ship drifted on, leaving behind the place where time stood still, carrying with them its memory, not as knowledge but as peace. When time returned, it did so gently, like light spilling back into a room after a long night. The stars began to move again, softly twinkling as if awakening from a dream. The hum of the ship came back to life, slow and steady. Morty opened his eyes and realized that his body felt heavier now, like the stillness they'd left behind had settled quietly inside him. Rick was at the controls again, his hands steady, eyes fixed ahead. Nothing about him seemed changed, and yet everything was. For a while, they said nothing. The silence between them was comfortable, alive with a faint sense of afterglow. Morty stared out at the cosmic horizon. The galaxies ahead looked different now, brighter maybe, or simply more honest. They weren't just decorations in the dark anymore. They were memories burning quietly in infinite motion. Finally, Morty spoke.
"Rick, did that really happen? That moment, the place where everything stopped?"
Rick didn't answer right away. He pressed a few buttons on the console, guiding the ship through a soft curve of starlight.
"Happen?"
he said finally. "Yeah, but not in the way you think. You can't measure something like that. You can only feel it." Morty nodded, slowly letting that sit.
"It's weird.
I feel like I brought some of it back with me. Like there's this stillness under everything now." Rick gave a faint, approving grunt.
Good. Most people spend their whole lives trying to hear that. You just had to get lost in eternity first. Morty smiled a little.
Yeah, easy. The stars outside began to stretch as they entered another fold of space. Colors rippled through the darkness like silk in slow motion. Rick adjusted their course, steering them toward a faint glimmer that looked like a dying nebula. "We'll stop there for repairs," he said. "This old ship took a hit when time froze." Morty watched him, noticing the subtle exhaustion in his movements. Rick had seen countless universes destroyed more than he'd saved, but in that moment Morty thought he looked lighter, like even Rick had carried a piece of peace back from the moment that never ended. They landed on the edge of a small asteroid drifting near the nebula's fading glow. The ground was glassy and dark, reflecting the stars above. Rick opened the hatch and stepped out, stretching, muttering something about gravitational drag coefficients. Morty followed, his boots crunching softly against the surface. The nebula before them was stunning, an ocean of dissolving color, glowing in shades of deep violet and amber. It pulsed gently, as though breathing its last. "It's dying," Morty said quietly. "Yeah," Rick replied. "Stars, universes, even time. Everything dies eventually. But death's not the end. It's just change." Morty crouched, picking up a shard of the glassy rock beneath his feet. It shimmered faintly in his palm, reflecting fragments of the nebula. "Feels like everything's breaking apart," he murmured. Rick looked at him for a moment, then sat down beside him on the edge of the rock. "That's because you're seeing clearly," he said softly. "Most people mistake holding on for strength. But sometimes, strength's just the courage to let things fall apart." They sat there for a while, side by side, watching the nebula dissolve. The light flickered, dimmed, then flared again, like a heartbeat refusing to fade quietly. Morty could almost hear it, a slow rhythm deep in the cosmos. "Rick," he said after a long silence, "do you ever miss the places we've been? The versions of us we left behind?" Rick's mouth twitched into something between a smirk and a sigh. "Miss is a complicated word, Morty. I remember them."
"That's enough. Missing means you still think you can get them back." Morty turned the glowing shard in his hand. "I think I miss them anyway." "Good," Rick said quietly.
"That means you care. Just don't drown in it." The nebula dimmed further, its colors fading into silver dust. Morty watched as it disassembled itself into quiet nothingness, and for some reason, he felt grateful. It was beautiful in its ending, graceful even. He realized that endings weren't really losses. They were transitions, a soft continuation in another form. As the light faded completely, the silence around them deepened. It was different from the stillness of the eternal moment. It wasn't cosmic or divine. It was personal, grounded, the kind of silence that happens between two people who understand each other without words. Rick finally stood up, brushing off his lab coat. "Come on, Morty, we've got one more stop before home." Morty followed, pausing at the ship's door to take one last look at the dying nebula.
"It's weird," he said. "I used to think the universe was loud.
But now it just feels like it's whispering." Rick glanced back with a faint grin.
"You're learning to listen, Morty. Took you long enough." They re-entered the ship.
The engines hummed back to life, low and steady.
As they lifted off, the nebula finally went dark behind them, its last breath scattering like soft snow across the void. Inside the cockpit, Morty watched the stars stretch into thin lines again.
He could feel the subtle difference in every motion, every flicker of light. Something had shifted. Time felt slower, more deliberate. Even Rick's movements seemed less restless. "Hey, Rick," Morty said quietly.
"You ever think maybe the universe isn't trying to teach us lessons or anything? Maybe it's just
showing us what it is, and it's up to us to notice?" Rick looked at him with a rare softness. "That's the smartest thing you've ever said, Morty. And yeah, maybe you're right. The universe doesn't owe us meaning. But sometimes meaning finds us anyway." Morty smiled faintly, leaning back in his seat. The stars flickered like quiet thoughts passing through the night. For once, he didn't feel the urge to ask where they were going. The journey itself was enough. Rick reached for his flask, took a sip, and sighed contentedly. "You know, kid," he said, "for all the chaos out there, it's weird how peaceful it can feel just sitting here, not doing anything." Morty nodded. "Yeah, feels like everything's still moving, but I don't have to chase it anymore." Rick smirked, closing his eyes. "That's because you finally stopped running from yourself." The ship floated onward through the quiet hum of space. Morty watched the stars fade into the dark, carrying their light into new beginnings. Somewhere deep in that silence, he thought he heard a faint echo, the heartbeat of the universe continuing, patient and endless. For the first time, Morty didn't need answers. He just needed this moment, the weight of returning, and the peace of finally understanding why he'd left at all. The ship floated through the edge of dawn, a borderland between darkness and the faintest breath of morning. The universe outside was quiet, a velvet sea scattered with dying stars. The hum of the ship was low, like a cat's purr beneath layers of drifting time. Rick was slumped in his chair, one arm hanging loosely, a bottle of something golden tilting precariously in his grasp. His breathing was deep, slow, almost childlike. For once, the genius of the multiverse had fallen asleep. Morty sat beside him, hands resting on the console. He didn't wake him. He just watched. There was something fragile about it, Rick's face soft without the usual tension, his hair catching the blue light of the control panel. The faint sound of a snore breaking the silence like an unexpected kindness. For so long, Morty had only known Rick in motion, building, destroying, drinking, running. Seeing him still felt like watching a storm forget how to rage. The ship drifted aimlessly through space. A distant nebula shimmered like spilled paint, its colors melting in slow ripples. Morty leaned back, eyes half closed, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a sidekick or a burden. He felt like a guardian, maybe even a friend. He adjusted a few switches, steadying their trajectory. The ship obeyed with a soft hum, gliding into a gentle orbit around a nameless moon. He thought about how many times he'd fallen asleep while Rick piloted them through chaos. Through collapsing dimensions, wormholes, and wild existential storms, Rick never stopped moving, as though slowing down would let something catch up to him. But now, watching him rest, Morty realized that maybe Rick had been running from this all along. The quiet. A simple, terrifying act of being at peace. Morty turned his gaze toward the stars. The night was deep and endless, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. He wondered how many worlds were dreaming at this very moment, how many lives were unfolding quietly while he floated here in between. Maybe that was the point. Not every moment had to be loud or meaningful. Some just had to be gentle. He thought about all the places they'd been, the planet of clouds that cried, the library of lost futures, the moment that never ended. Each one had left something behind inside him. Little echoes, little lessons. He used to think the universe was testing him, forcing him to grow up. But now he understood. The universe wasn't testing anyone. It was just showing itself, endlessly patient, waiting for him to notice. Rick stirred slightly, murmuring something incomprehensible in his sleep. Morty smiled. It was strange how even in rest, Rick seemed to be dreaming of equations. His fingers twitched as if solving some invisible formula against the air. Morty whispered softly, "You can rest, Rick. It's okay." The words drifted into the cabin and vanished. But for a second, Rick's breathing slowed, deepened. Maybe he heard it, or maybe the ship did. The lights dimmed slightly as though the machine itself was easing into the calm. The silence filled every corner, thick and comforting. Morty glanced at the navigation screen. There was no destination. Just empty coordinates, infinite space stretching in every direction. Normally, that would have terrified him. Now it felt perfect. He didn't need to know where they were going.
Not tonight.
He closed his eyes and let his thoughts wander. He remembered the first time Rick had dragged him into space, the sheer panic, the thrill, the disbelief. Back then, he thought adventure was about escaping.
Escaping boredom, pain, life.
But it wasn't. Adventure was just another way of searching for quiet, for a reason to stop running. The stars shifted slightly as the ship rotated. Outside, the first light of a nearby sun began to spread through the void. Not a bright blaze, but a tender hue of amber and rose, painting the cockpit in soft warmth. It brushed over Rick's face, softening every wrinkle, every scar left by too many universes. For the first time, he looked peaceful. Morty leaned forward, resting his chin on his arms.
"You've done enough, Rick," he whispered.
"You can rest now. I'll take it from here." The words surprised him. They came out heavier than he expected, like something that had been waiting for years to be spoken. He meant them, not as a goodbye, but as a quiet promise. Maybe every child eventually reaches this moment, the realization that the person who once seemed invincible is still human, still breakable, still in need of rest. He sat there, keeping watch as the ship drifted through the dawn.
Hours, or maybe minutes, passed.
Time didn't seem to move in its usual way anymore. It flowed softly like water, like memory. Occasionally, Morty adjusted the ship's path, tiny movements that felt sacred somehow, guiding the journey without trying to control it. At one point, Rick mumbled something and shifted, eyes fluttering half open.
"Oh, Morty," he muttered groggily, "you didn't crash us, did you?"
Morty chuckled softly. "No, Rick, we're fine. You can go back to sleep." Rick's eyes drifted closed again, but a faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Good job, kid," he whispered, almost too quiet to hear. Morty sat in the half-light, watching the stars pass. That one simple sentence echoed in his chest like a melody. "Good job, kid." It wasn't loud or emotional, but it was everything. The first sun rose fully then, painting the cockpit in liquid gold. The light wrapped around them both, slow and forgiving. Morty blinked against the brightness, feeling warmth spread across his face. It wasn't just sunlight, it was understanding. The kind that only comes after a long journey through shadow. He realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Not of growing up, not of loss, not even of endings. He'd seen too much to believe that anything truly ended. Things changed form, light into memory, motion into stillness, fear into quiet. Maybe even Rick one day would become something gentler than he'd ever let himself be. Morty reached out and placed his hand gently on the console, feeling the hum beneath his fingertips. The ship pulsed back, alive, loyal, patient. Together they floated on through the infinite morning. As the stars gave way to dawn, Morty whispered, "We don't have to land yet." And so they didn't. The ship drifted endlessly, quietly, through the soft bloom of light. A silent witness to two travelers who had finally found what they didn't know they'd been seeking all along. Peace. It happened on a night that felt both infinite and impossibly small, as though time itself had curled inward to whisper something private. The stars were quiet again, but their silence no longer felt empty. It felt like an invitation. Morty stood by the viewport of the ship, eyes fixed on a dim horizon where light shimmered without source, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. There was a pull in it, not of gravity but of memory, a familiar whisper that had been following him since that first sleepless night when he heard the stars speak his name. Rick was asleep again, head buried in his arms, the smell of engine oil and old whiskey mingling in the air. Morty didn't wake him.
Instead, he followed the pull.
He stepped toward the back of the ship, past the cluttered tables and silent machines, until he found the small door Rick never talked about. A door that shouldn't have existed, one that seemed to glow faintly from within. For reasons he couldn't explain, Morty opened it. Light spilled out, soft and translucent, wrapping around him like silk. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warm, familiar, filled with the sound of distant laughter and forgotten music. When he stepped through, gravity vanished. The floor became light, the walls shimmered like water, and he realized he was standing inside something alive. A labyrinth made not of matter, but of memory. Every wall flickered with faint images, translucent echoes of moments he almost recognized. A toy falling from a child's hand, Rick's younger face smiling in a way Morty had never seen, the image of his mother watching rain slide down a window. Morty moved slowly, afraid to disturb whatever dream he'd entered. The air was gentle, each breath tasting faintly of rain and starlight. The corridors curved like rivers of glass, leading him deeper into the glow. With each turn, the memories became clearer, more personal. He saw himself at 10 years old, standing in his backyard with a telescope too big for his small hands. He saw Summer chasing fireflies. He saw his mother singing softly to herself in the kitchen, unaware he was watching. Each memory floated past like a ghost, beautiful and untouchable. At first, he tried to speak to them, reaching out, whispering their names, but the echoes only smiled faintly and drifted on. They weren't really people. They were impressions, soft fingerprints of emotion left behind by time. He began to understand that this place wasn't showing him what was gone. It was reminding him what was never truly lost. As he wandered deeper, the light grew brighter, shifting from gold to pale blue, then to white, so soft it felt like moonlight on skin. The walls began to hum faintly, and Morty realized it wasn't random. It was music. A slow, circular melody, built from the sounds of laughter, heartbeats and sighs. Every note was familiar, but he couldn't place it. It felt like the sound of growing up. He turned a final corner and entered a chamber, vast and silent. At its center stood a single mirror, tall and rippling like liquid silver. It glowed faintly, and as he approached, the whispers returned. That same voice from the stars, gentle and endless. "Morty," it said, not as a question, but as a memory remembering itself. He stood before the mirror and looked. What stared back wasn't quite him, not as he was. The reflection seemed older, calmer. His shoulders were relaxed, his eyes steady. There was no fear, no guilt, no doubt in that version of himself, just quiet understanding. The mirrored Morty smiled, not wide, not forced, just a small, knowing curve of peace, and for a long time, neither of them moved. Then the reflection spoke, though its lips didn't move. "You've been listening for so long," it said softly. "You thought you were lost, but you were only learning how to hear," Morty blinked. "Hear what?" "Silence," the voice said. "The kind that comes after you stop trying to make sense of everything." He wanted to argue, but the moment was too gentle for words. He just stood there, the warmth of the labyrinth wrapping around him, and let the thought sink in. Maybe all this time he'd been chasing answers, expecting meaning to reveal itself in some grand, scientific revelation. But it wasn't like that. The truth, if there was one, wasn't loud or complicated. It was simple. It was this: the acceptance of being small and alive and part of something endless. The mirror rippled softly, and Morty's reflection began to fade, replaced by new images. Rick, younger, laughing with another scientist in a world of purple skies, his mother holding him as a baby, his own hand reaching out to comfort someone crying. He realized they were all fragments of love, quiet, ordinary, human love that had always existed, even in the chaos. Tears slipped down his cheek without warning.
Not sadness exactly, just release.
The labyrinth answered with a low, kind hum. "You won't. You'll carry it the way light carries warmth, unseen but always there." Morty nodded, breathing deeply. He felt lighter. The walls around him shimmered again, growing transparent, revealing a vast sky beyond, endless stars turning slowly, rhythmically, like the gentle breath of the universe itself. For the first time in his life, Morty felt completely still inside. No confusion, no noise, no trying to prove anything. Just presence. When he finally stepped back toward the door, the labyrinth began to dissolve, each wall folding into pure light. As he walked, the whispers followed. Not words anymore, but a melody of memory and peace. The closer he got to the exit, the softer it became, until it faded entirely. He stepped back onto the ship, blinking against the dim light. Rick was still asleep, the ship still humming its gentle lullaby. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, but inside everything had changed. Morty walked over, sat in his chair, and looked out at the stars. They didn't whisper this time, they listened. For a long while, he just breathed. The labyrinth of light still shimmered faintly in his mind, not as a dream, but as a truth too quiet to explain. He thought of his reflection, calm, older, unafraid, and smiled softly. He whispered to the stars, "I think I get it now." The ship drifted on, silent and eternal, carrying them both toward the next quiet wonder, waiting beyond the horizon of thought. It began without warning. One moment the universe moved in its usual slow rhythm, planets orbiting, suns burning, nebulae breathing light into the dark. Then something shifted, a pause so subtle that it might have been imagined, and yet Morty felt it immediately. He was standing by the window of the ship when he noticed the stars no longer twinkled. The constellations were still there, but frozen, caught mid-blink. It was as though creation itself had taken a deep breath and forgotten to let it go. Rick stood beside him, unusually quiet. His hair caught the glow of the stilled cosmos, silver and faintly trembling.
"Well, that's new," he murmured, voice softer than usual. No panic.
Just the kind of calm that comes when you've already seen too much to be surprised. Morty turned toward him, expecting the usual explanations. The quantum mechanics, the absurd metaphors, the off-handed humor meant to hide the weight of things. But Rick said nothing. He just stared, his eyes reflecting the unmoving stars.
Outside, even light had slowed.
Rays from a distant sun stretched like honey, suspended mid-air. Dust drifted through the void as though trapped in amber. Inside the ship, time still moved, but slower. The hum of the engines dragged into a lazy heartbeat, every sound softened by distance. Morty felt the stillness sink into him, thick and tender. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Morty asked, "Did we do this?" Rick tilted his head slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Maybe it did it on its own. Why would it stop?" Morty whispered. Rick sighed, not tired, but peaceful.
"Maybe it's just tired, Morty. You ever think about that? Even universes need a rest." Morty looked back out at the stars.
There was a strange, melancholy beauty to it. This frozen stillness, this suspended perfection. It didn't feel wrong.
It felt like mercy.
All those worlds, all those lives and movements finally allowed to breathe. Maybe this was what peace looked like from the outside. Rick walked to the console and sat down heavily, elbows on knees. His voice was almost tender when he said, "You know, I used to be scared of this. The idea that things could just stop.
I thought if I kept moving, building, running, thinking, I could keep it all spinning."
But that's not how any of this works. You can't outsmart the pause." Morty smiled faintly. "You mean like, the universe is taking a nap?" Rick huffed a laugh. "Yeah, kid. Cosmic nap time.
Everything's earned it." The ship drifted through the stillness like a dream.
Morty pressed his hand against the glass, his reflection faint in the dim light. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Rick leaned back, eyes soft and distant. "Nothing."
That's the point. And somehow that answer was enough.
They sat there for what might have been hours or seconds. Time no longer meant anything here. Morty began to notice little things he'd never seen before. The faint crack in the ship's console that caught the starlight like a river. The gentle rise and fall of Rick's chest as he breathed. The soft, ticking sound the lights made when the circuits cooled. Everything felt so intimate, so fragile. He thought about all the chaos they'd lived through, the wild, terrifying, beautiful mess of their adventures. Every dimension, every paradox, every endless attempt to control what couldn't be controlled. Maybe this was what it was all leading to. Not a revelation, but a pause. Morty closed his eyes, letting the silence fill him. He thought of the labyrinth of light he'd wandered through, of his reflection smiling back at him with quiet understanding. Maybe this was the next step, not forward, but inward, a deeper kind of stillness. He whispered, barely audible, "I think I'm ready to stop running too." Rick looked over, and for once, there was no sarcasm in his expression, just pride, a small, tired smile. "You did good, kid," he said softly. "You learned the one thing I never could. How to let go." Morty felt something warm build behind his eyes, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just nodded, eyes glistening. Rick reached into his coat, pulling out a small metal flask. He turned it over in his hands for a moment before setting it down gently on the console, unopened. "Guess I don't need that tonight," he muttered. They watched the frozen stars together. Neither moved. Neither wanted to. Eventually, Morty noticed something. Faint, almost imperceptible. The light from the distant sun began to move again, the golden rays stretching ever so slightly. A slow pulse returned to the stars, subtle and rhythmic, like a sleeping giant stirring. The universe hadn't stopped forever. It had just paused, to rest, to remember to breathe. Rick smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "See that? Even the cosmos gets back up eventually." Morty nodded, still watching the slow movement return to the heavens. "Guess it's okay to stop sometimes." "Yeah," Rick said, eyes softening. "That's what living really is. Learning when to stop and when to start again." They sat there in silence as the stars began to shimmer back to life, one by one. But something about the moment stayed still inside them. The kind of stillness that doesn't fade when motion returns. The stillness of understanding. Morty thought about his mother, his sister, the small lives on distant planets they'd passed by without noticing. He thought about the countless versions of himself he'd seen, some angry, some afraid, some endlessly searching. And now, in this soft pause of rebirth, he felt them all inside him, peaceful, whole. The ship's hum grew steady again, like a heartbeat finding rhythm after a long rest. Rick leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes and said almost to himself, "I'm proud of you, Morty." Morty turned to look at him, surprised by how quiet and real the words were. No punchline. No joke, just truth. "Thanks, Rick," he said softly. "I'm proud of you too." Rick chuckled under his breath. "Don't get weird about it." Morty smiled but didn't respond. Outside, the stars began to spin again, slow at first, then steady as the great cosmic dance resumed. But the universe didn't feel the same anymore. It felt gentler, lighter, as though it too had learned something about forgiveness. The ship drifted forward through the rekindled light. Morty pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the stars glide by. Everything was moving again, but inside him, something remained still, like the center of a wheel that never turns. He closed his eyes, breathed in, and felt it. That quiet, golden peace that had always been waiting. The stars whispered once more, not in words, but in presence. And somewhere deep inside that silence, Morty understood. Nothing truly ends. Things pause. They breathe. They begin again. Outside, the universe turned once more, slow, endless, mercifully alive. When the universe began to move again, it did so quietly, as if embarrassed by its own stillness. The stars pulsed faintly at first, shy glimmers returning to their natural rhythm. Morty sat by the viewport, eyes half-lidded, watching constellations reform like slow heartbeats in the dark. Every flicker of light felt familiar, almost personal, as though the cosmos remembered him, not just as an observer, but as something it had once dreamed. Rick was asleep in his chair, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. The rare sight of him resting made the room feel even quieter. There was no sound but the gentle whir of the ship, the hum of circuits resuming their cosmic lullaby. Morty stared into the void and thought of echoes, the invisible trails left behind by voices, footsteps, memories. He wondered if every choice they'd made left a ripple like that, moving endlessly through space-time. Maybe nothing ever really disappeared. Maybe it just traveled far enough away that it could no longer be heard. The thought comforted him. Even the mistakes, the pain, the laughter. Perhaps they were all still out there, drifting between galaxies, waiting to be remembered by something greater. The stars outside seemed to agree. Their light shimmered with a kind of patient affection, a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat made of time. Morty felt as if the whole universe was breathing again, and he was breathing with it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing answers. He wasn't running from danger or trying to make sense of the chaos. He was just here, alive, in a moment that asked nothing of him but presence. Rick stirred and opened one eye, squinting at the window. Still staring into infinity, huh? His voice was gravelly, half asleep, but not unkind. Morty smiled faintly.
Yeah, it's kind of beautiful when it's not trying to kill us, Rick chuckled, the sound dry and warm. You're not wrong. He leaned back again, gaze following Morty's. You know what's funny?
I used to think the universe was indifferent, cold, meaningless. But lately I'm not so sure.
Look at it out there.
It's too careful, too deliberate.
Like it's trying to tell us something, but we're too loud to hear it. Morty tilted his head.
Tell us what? Rick took a long pause before answering. That it remembers us. Every atom we touch, every thought we send out, it keeps them.
Rewrites them into something new. Maybe that's what echoes really are.
The universe thinking about us after we're gone. Morty let that sink in. So like,
even if we die, we don't really disappear.
Rick gave a small shrug. Nothing does. He just changes costume. Morty smiled softly at that. The ship glided through a field of cosmic dust, swirling blue and silver particles dancing around the hull like quiet fireworks. The lights refracted across the glass, painting faint reflections across their faces. For a moment, Morty thought he saw shapes within the dust. Outlines of figures, shadows of memories. Maybe it was his imagination or maybe something deeper. He thought he saw his mother's smile, the curve of Summer's laugh, even his own younger self, eyes wide with wonder before the universe had worn him down. Rick noticed the look on his face and murmured, "They're not gone, you know."
None of them.
The people we've lost, the things we've done, they all echo. Every version of us out there remembers something different, but the feeling's the same. Morty didn't answer. He just nodded, watching the dust trail away behind them like soft ghosts dissolving into space. The hum of the ship deepened, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of their journey began to resemble a melody, a low, endless note that carried them forward. He thought about everything they'd been through. The universes destroyed, the lives reset, the endless repetition of chaos and repair. And yet here, in the quiet aftermath, there was a gentleness he hadn't expected. It was as if the universe, having paused and remembered itself, had chosen to forgive. Rick stood and stretched, joints cracking softly in the still air.
I'm going to check the core systems.
Make sure we're not stuck in some recursive stasis field or whatever. Morty nodded absently, still lost in the stars. When Rick disappeared down the corridor, the silence deepened. It wasn't empty, it was full, filled with echoes of everything that had ever been. Morty could almost hear them, laughter, fragments of conversations, moments of kindness that had gone unnoticed. They weren't loud, but they were present, shimmering beneath the noise of existence. He whispered, "Are you still there?" Not to anyone in particular, but to the echoes themselves, to the parts of the universe that had once held him, frightened him, loved him. The response wasn't in words. It was a feeling, a warmth spreading through the cold vacuum like light remembered. When Rick returned, his usual sharpness had softened. "Everything's fine," he said. "Engines are stable. Space-time's breathing normally again." He paused, looking at Morty for a long moment. "You okay, kid?" Morty turned to him, eyes reflecting the faint gold of the stars. "Yeah, I think I am." Rick gave a small nod, almost proud. "Good. Took us a few universes to get here." They shared a quiet laugh. Then, without speaking further, Rick dimmed the lights. The ship drifted onward, no longer rushing, no longer fleeing, just gliding through the soft wake of creation. Outside, the stars formed patterns Morty had never seen before.
Maybe they were new.
Maybe they'd always been there, waiting for him to notice. As he watched, he felt something shift inside him. Not an answer, but an understanding. The universe wasn't a cold machine or a random accident. It was a memory, a vast, self-aware echo of everything that had ever loved or feared or dreamed. And maybe, just maybe, consciousness itself was the way it remembered. He leaned back in his seat, eyes half closing, his reflection blurring into the stars. Rick hummed softly under his breath, an old tune from some forgotten place. The sound mingled with the hum of the engines, with the pulse of distant galaxies, until Morty could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. In that moment, there were no boundaries, just echo and remembrance, vibration and silence, Morty and the universe whispering to each other in perfect unison. And as the ship drifted deeper into the velvet dark, Morty smiled, because he finally understood, even when everything ends, something always remembers. Morning, if such a thing existed in deep space, arrived without sunrise, only a slow warming of color against the edges of infinity. The ship floated through a sea of silver dust, its hull glowing faintly in the half-light of an unnamed star. Rick was already awake, calibrating something that didn't need calibrating, while Morty stood by the door with a small pack slung over his shoulder. There was no fight, no explosion, no final speech, just a quiet moment between breaths. Morty looked at Rick the way people look at photographs before they leave home, with love that doesn't know where to go. Rick didn't meet his eyes at first.
He just said, "Are you sure about this, kid?"
His tone was casual, but the words wobbled around the edges. "Yeah," Morty said softly. "I think I need to just
see things for myself for a while. Not through wormholes or experiments, just..."
"Slow," Rick grunted, pretending to check the navigation screen. "Slow's overrated. Nothing in the universe actually stops, you know," Morty smiled. "Maybe not. But light does rest sometimes. It bends, it softens."
"It takes the long way home." Rick froze for a moment, that sentence landing somewhere deep, somewhere unguarded.
He finally turned toward Morty, his eyes a strange mixture of pride and loss. "You've been listening too much." "Guess I learned from the best," Morty replied. Rick laughed under his breath, that low, gravelly sound that always made the silence feel safer. He grabbed a small metal box from a nearby shelf and tossed it toward Morty. "Here, portable portal beacon. Don't use it unless you're actually dying or bored. Those are basically the same thing." Morty caught it, thumb tracing the etched initials, RS, faintly scratched into the metal.
"Thanks, Rick, for everything. Even the messed up stuff. Don't thank me for that," Rick said, shaking his head.
"Just try to be a little better than me."
That's how this whole stupid cycle works. They stood there for a long while, the sound of distant machinery filling the space between words.
There was no grand farewell, no swelling music, just a shared understanding that some goodbyes were meant to be quiet. The kind that let love breathe instead of breaking it apart. Morty stepped toward the exit, the soft blue glow of the door reflecting off his face. "Where will you go?" he asked. Rick smirked. Wherever the silence needs a little noise. Morty smiled, nodded once, and stepped into the light. The planet below was calm, a small town that seemed carved out of peace itself. Streets shimmered faintly under the glow of hovering lanterns. Every window carried a soft pulse, like a heartbeat made of light. Morty walked slowly, feeling the weight of stillness settle into his bones. The air was warm, almost drowsy, scented faintly with rain. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime whispered. He realized he hadn't heard anything so human in years. He wandered without purpose, letting the town lead him. Children laughed somewhere distant, their voices fading like ripples across water. Elderly figures sat on porches sipping from steaming cups, unbothered by time.
Nobody rushed.
Nobody argued. It was as though the universe itself had decided to stop spinning just enough to remember what rest felt like. He found a small cafe near the edge of a lake. If cafe could describe a place this simple. A wooden counter, 2 stools, and a lantern hanging from a crooked beam. The barista, an old woman with soft grey eyes, didn't ask questions. She just handed him a cup of something that shimmered like melted gold. "You look like someone who's been travelling for a long time," she said. "Yeah," Morty murmured, smiling faintly. "Guess you could say that." "Then drink slow," she replied. "Light only learns to rest when it remembers it's tired." He took a sip. The flavour was impossible. Warm and cool, sharp and soft all at once. It reminded him of every moment he'd ever wished he could pause. He sat by the window watching the lake. Each wave glowed faintly, reflecting constellations that didn't belong to this sky. He wondered if Rick could see them too from wherever he was. As the day passed, he began to notice something strange. The light in this place moved differently. It didn't blaze or fade, it lingered like it was reluctant to leave. Even shadows felt gentle here, as if resting were their natural state. He thought about Rick again. The constant motion, the endless inventions, the way he could never stop running, even from himself. Morty wondered if this quiet could ever reach him. At dusk, he walked to the edge of the water and looked at his reflection. He looked older. Not in years, but in stillness. His face no longer carried the frantic curiosity of a boy chasing after cosmic chaos. Instead, there was peace. He knelt and dipped his hand into the lake. The water glowed around his fingers, humming softly. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard the stars whisper again. But this time, they weren't calling his name. They were simply saying goodnight. He stayed there until the last traces of light dimmed into evening. The town began to hum with low, melodic tones, lights sinking with rhythm, like an entire world gently breathing in sleep. Morty smiled, realizing that rest wasn't the opposite of living. It was part of it. The universe needed to exhale, just like he did. He walked back toward the cafe, now lit with soft blue lamps. The woman was gone, but she had left a note by the counter.
It read, "Some lights don't fade.
They just find quieter skies." Morty folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He looked up at the stars, countless, calm and kind, and whispered, "Good night, Rick." Far away, on a ship adrift between worlds, Rick sat in his chair with a bottle untouched beside him. He stared at the stars through the viewport, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to move. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it. That same quiet Morty had found. He smiled faintly, muttered something only the stars could hear, and let his eyes close. Across the vastness of everything, light finally learned to rest. The night arrived without ceremony, slipping into the quiet edges of Morty's world like a familiar friend. The town had gone still, the soft glow from the lanterns breathing in slow rhythm with the stars. Morty lay in a small room above the cafe, curtains half drawn, the window open to the whisper of the lake. The air smelled of warm wood and silver rain. He didn't dream right away. Instead, he listened to the faint hum of light, to the murmur of water against the shore, to the slow pulse of a world that had learned to rest. It felt like the whole universe was inhaling and exhaling beside him, every heartbeat softer than the last. When sleep finally came, it did not come as darkness but as a bloom of color. Pale blues, soft golds, the quiet silver of memory. Morty found himself walking through the sky. The stars were close, gentle, like fireflies circling him. He wasn't afraid. There was no weight to his body, no boundaries between breath and thought. Just an infinite calm that felt like recognition. Somewhere deep within that stillness, a voice began to form. The same one that had called to him all those nights ago. The whisper that had once felt distant now spoke like something familiar, tender, and grateful. "Thank you for listening," it said. Morty closed his eyes. He didn't need to ask who it was. He understood now that the voice wasn't from outside, not from the stars, not from some forgotten god or cosmic echo. It was the quiet within him, the part that had learned to love the world by watching it, to forgive by simply existing. Every star was a thought, every shimmer a heartbeat, and the whisper was the sound of himself remembering who he'd always been. He drifted further past constellations that moved like living things, their trails weaving gentle paths through the dark. Each star pulsed once as he passed, like it was acknowledging him. A wordless farewell. Below, the clouds shimmered in waves of silver, moving as if the entire sky were an ocean and he was walking along its surface. He thought of Rick then, the countless nights, the adventures, the chaos, and the rare, quiet moments when nothing needed to explode for life to feel full. He saw Rick as he had been, laughing, inventing, arguing, protecting, always pretending not to care, but always staying close enough that Morty never truly felt alone. Morty whispered softly into the still air. "You were always watching, weren't you?" And though there was no answer, the stars seemed to flicker in agreement. He found himself standing before a horizon made of light, an endless dawn that didn't rise or fall, just shimmered gently like a heartbeat. The voice returned, softer now, almost fading. "It's time," it said. "Not to end, but to rest." Morty smiled. "Yeah, I think I'm ready." He took one last step, and the horizon unfolded. Not a door, not a boundary, but a feeling of warmth that filled him from within. The light didn't blind or erase him. It embraced him the way sleep does when it finally arrives after a long day of being human. In that warmth, he felt everything he had ever loved. His mother's laughter, his father's confusion, Summer's strength, even Rick's tired eyes, all of it blending into one endless softness. And then, just before he vanished into the dream, he heard it again. Rick's voice. Not in the way he usually heard it, but quieter, gentler. "Proud of you, kid," Morty smiled, eyes closed, as the world folded into stillness. Far away, in the ship, drifting through silent space, Rick woke with a start. He didn't know why, but his chest felt lighter. The ship's console blinked faintly, displaying a small, pulsing dot, Morty's last beacon signal, flickering for the briefest moment before fading into nothing. Rick stared at it for a long time, his reflection caught in the glass. There was no sadness, only the calm that comes when something has finally found its place. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled deeply, and looked out at the infinite. The stars shimmered as they always had, but tonight they seemed closer, as if they too were breathing with him. He reached for his flask, hesitated, then set it aside. Instead, he just sat there, watching. The hum of the ship was steady, almost like a heartbeat. For the first time in years, Rick didn't feel the need to run from it. He simply let the silence hold him. The universe, vast and unknowable, didn't ask anything of him. It just was. Soft, endless, forgiving. Rick leaned his head back and whispered into the dark. "Sleep well, kid," outside, a faint light passed across the viewport. A comet, maybe, or something stranger. It glowed with a familiar hue, pale and gold, flickering softly like a memory moving through time. Rick watched it disappear into the distance, and in that instant he understood that goodbyes weren't endings. They were transformations. The quiet turning of one kind of light into another. He closed his eyes, let out a slow sigh, and whispered to no one and everything all at once. "Everything's gonna be okay, man." The ship continued drifting through the silver dark, its trail leaving a faint shimmer across the quiet between stars. Somewhere far below, Morty's town glowed faintly against the horizon. Lights in windows still pulsing like gentle breaths. The universe slept. The stars, at peace, whispered softly to one another, their voices folding into the endless hush of everything that ever was. And in that quiet, both of them, the genius and the dreamer, the teacher and the boy, rested in their own way, not apart, but across the same vast lullaby, forever linked by the hum of understanding. And in the quiet between stars, he finally understood. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.